For 20 years, Grayson Hale fell asleep wondering if the woman who gave him away ever thought about him at all. He pictured her 1,000 different ways. Poor. Scared. Maybe even dead. He never once pictured her the way she actually turned out to be. He never imagined that the woman who handed him over as a newborn, without a name, without a note, without a single word of explanation, was sitting on a fortune worth $400 million. He never imagined that when he finally found her, 20 years of silence would end not with an apology, but with a decision so unexpected that even her own lawyers didn't see it coming. This is the story of what happens when the truth is worth more than money, and one man decides that some things simply cannot be bought back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Grayson grew up in a small house in Ohio, raised by two people who loved him fiercely but never let him forget, gently, that he had come from somewhere else. His adoptive parents, Frank and Linda Hale, kept a manila folder locked in a drawer in the hallway closet for as long as he could remember. He found it when he was 11, flipping through papers he didn't understand, staring at a birth certificate with a name that wasn't his and a blank space where a mother's signature should have been. From that day forward, Grayson carried a single question with him everywhere he went, into every classroom, every friendship, every quiet moment before sleep. Who was she, and why did she let him go? He asked his parents once, and only once, and the look on their faces told him it was a question they couldn't answer either. By the time Grayson turned 30, that question had followed him through 2 failed relationships, a job he didn't love, and countless nights spent scrolling through adoption forums searching for a piece of himself he couldn't name. He had almost given up. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, an envelope arrived at his apartment with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed and signed, containing nothing but a name, a city, and 11 words that would change the rest of his life. Somewhere out there, someone had been keeping track of him the entire time. The name on that paper belonged to a woman most of the country would recognize instantly, though Grayson had no idea who she was when he first read it. Eleanor Whitmore. Head of one of the largest logistics empires on the East Coast, a woman who had built her fortune from nothing after inheriting a struggling family business and turning it into an industry giant. She rarely gave interviews. She rarely appeared in photographs that weren't taken from a distance. And in 30 years of headlines about her company, not one article, not one profile, not one leaked document, ever mentioned that she had once given up a son. Grayson didn't sleep that night. He searched her name until sunrise, scrolling through business articles, shareholder reports, a handful of grainy paparazzi photos taken outside a courthouse years earlier. None of it made sense. A woman with that much money, that much power, that many resources, had never once tried to find him. Or had she? He kept coming back to the envelope, to the fact that someone had sent it, that someone inside her world had decided he deserved to know the truth even if she never would have told him herself. He had exactly 2 questions burning in his chest by morning. Why did she give him up in the first place, and why, after everything, was someone risking her secret now? He booked a flight 3 days later, using money he didn't really have, to a city he had never once set foot in. He told himself he wasn't going for the money. He told himself, over and over on that flight, that all he wanted was an answer, one honest answer, to a question that had shaped every single year of his life. But somewhere over the Atlantic, staring out at nothing, Grayson Hale began to understand that the truth waiting for him on the ground was going to be far more complicated, and far more dangerous to the people protecting it, than he ever could have prepared for. By the time his plane landed, Eleanor Whitmore already knew he was coming. She had known for exactly 3 days, ever since a member of her own household, someone she trusted completely, made a choice that would put everything she had spent 30 years building at risk. What Grayson didn't know yet, and what Eleanor herself had no way of predicting, was that this reunion was never going to end the way either of them expected. Somewhere between the airport and the gates of a mansion Grayson had only seen in photographs, the story of a mother and the son she gave away was about to take a turn that neither the lawyers, nor the family, nor the 20 years of silence, could have prepared anyone for. To understand why Grayson Hale got on that plane, you have to understand the life he was running from, and the life he never stopped searching for underneath it. Grayson wasn't unhappy growing up. Frank and Linda Hale gave him everything two working parents in a small Ohio town could give a child: birthday parties in the backyard, Sunday dinners that ran too long, a father who taught him to fix a carburetor before he taught him to drive. But there was a version of Grayson that existed only in the quiet hours, the version that stared at his own reflection looking for a stranger's face staring back. He didn't look like Frank. He didn't look like Linda. He didn't look like anyone in a single photograph on the living room wall, and by the time he was old enough to understand what that meant, the question had already taken root somewhere he couldn't dig it out. By middle school, Grayson had learned to keep the question to himself. He watched his friends complain about parents who didn't understand them, and he never told a single one of them how much he would have given for a mother who simply existed to misunderstand him. He built a life around the things he could control. He was a decent student, a better athlete, the kind of kid teachers described as easy to have in class. Underneath all of it, he kept a private habit that Frank and Linda never fully knew about, searching his own name and his birth date on library computers after school, hoping some database somewhere had an answer he wasn't allowed to have yet. He never found one. Not once, not for years. There were smaller moments too, the kind that never make it into a courtroom file but shape a person just as much. A teacher once asked the class to bring in a baby photo for a project, and Grayson brought in the only one he had, taken 3 weeks after he came home with Frank and Linda, and he remembers standing at the front of the room unable to answer a simple question about what he weighed at birth. A doctor once asked about family medical history during a routine appointment, and Grayson sat there with nothing to offer, no allergies to report, no conditions to flag, just an empty space on a clipboard that reminded him, every single time, how much of himself was simply unknown. High school brought its own quiet reminders. Grayson remembers a genetics unit in biology class where students traced eye color and blood type back through their parents, and he remembers raising his hand to ask the teacher, in front of the entire room, what a student was supposed to do when half of that chart simply didn't exist. The teacher hadn't known what to say. Neither had Grayson, really, but the question had been sitting in him for years, and something about saying it out loud in front of 30 classmates made the absence feel less like a secret and more like a fact he was finally allowed to name. Everything changed the year Grayson turned 18. Under Ohio law, he was finally old enough to request his original birth record, the one sealed away since the day he was adopted. He remembers the drive to the county office better than he remembers most of his childhood: the fluorescent lighting, the clerk who barely looked up from her desk, the manila envelope that felt heavier in his hands than paper had any right to feel. Inside was a name. Not the name he expected, not a face, not an address, just a name typed in black ink on a document decades old. He sat in his car in that parking lot for almost an hour before he could bring himself to drive home, holding on to the only piece of his mother he had ever been given, terrified that it might also be the last. The name led nowhere for years. Grayson searched it during college, during 2 jobs that never quite fit, during a relationship that ended partly because he could never fully explain what he was looking for or why he needed to keep looking. Every search came back empty, every lead dissolved into nothing, until the woman behind that name started to feel less like a person and more like a ghost he had invented to explain the hole in his own life. Friends told him to let it go. His adoptive parents, gently and without ever asking him to stop, made it clear they would support him either way. But Grayson had built his entire identity around one unanswered question, and a life without the answer had started to feel unfinished in a way he couldn't put into words. There were moments Grayson nearly gave it up entirely. He remembers deleting every bookmarked adoption forum from his laptop after his relationship ended, telling himself the search had cost him more than it had ever given back. That resolve rarely lasted more than a few weeks. He would find himself typing the same name into a search bar late at night, almost without deciding to, as though some part of him had never actually agreed to stop looking in the first place, no matter how many times the rest of him tried to convince himself otherwise. What Grayson never knew, during any of those years of searching, was that he wasn't searching alone. 2 states away, inside a house far larger than anything he had ever set foot in, Eleanor Whitmore kept a single photograph locked in a drawer of her own, a photograph of a newborn baby she had held for exactly 6 minutes before signing him away forever. Eleanor was 22 years old when Grayson was born, unmarried, and standing at the edge of a family business that would not survive a scandal. She didn't give him up because she didn't want him. She gave him up because the people around her convinced her it was the only way either of them would survive what was coming. For 20 years, she told herself that not knowing where he ended up was easier than knowing and being unable to reach him. It wasn't. Eleanor built an empire in the years that followed, turning a struggling family shipping company into one of the largest logistics operations on the East Coast, but success never filled the space that decision had carved out of her. She hired investigators twice over the decades, quietly, without her family's knowledge, and both times she called them off before they finished the job, telling herself she wasn't ready, telling herself he was better off not knowing a woman who had let him go so easily. What she never accounted for was someone inside her own household deciding, after watching her carry that secret for 20 years, that the choice was no longer hers alone to make. That decision, made by someone she trusted completely, was the reason an envelope with no return address ended up on Grayson's doorstep at all. By the time Grayson boarded that flight, 2 lives that had been running in parallel for 2 decades, one built on searching and one built on silence, were finally about to collide. Neither of them had any way of knowing that the reunion they were both walking toward would not simply answer the question that had haunted them for 20 years. It would force each of them to make a decision that neither one was prepared for, one that would test what family actually means when money, loyalty, and 20 years of secrecy are all sitting in the same room. The car that picked Grayson Hale up from the airport wasn't what he expected. No driver in a suit, no sign with his name on it, just a plain black sedan sent by someone who had given the service strict instructions not to ask questions. Grayson didn't know it yet, but every step of his arrival had already been arranged by someone inside the Whitmore household who was taking an enormous risk simply by letting him through the front gate. He watched the city give way to open land, then to a long private road lined with trees older than the company Eleanor Whitmore had built her name on. By the time the house came into view, Grayson understood, for the first time, exactly how far apart his life and hers had actually grown. The woman who opened the door wasn't Eleanor. Her name was Charlotte, and she introduced herself simply as someone who worked closely with the family, offering no explanation for why she had personally driven the car request through, why she had personally cleared his name past 3 layers of security, or why her hands were visibly shaking as she led him inside. Grayson would spend the rest of that day assuming Charlotte was staff. It would be hours before he learned the truth, that the woman who had risked everything to bring him here wasn't an employee of the Whitmore family at all. She was a Whitmore herself, and she had known about him for exactly 6 months. Eleanor refused to see him. Not at first. Grayson sat in a waiting room designed to feel like a living room, surrounded by furniture worth more than his entire apartment, for nearly 3 hours while lawyers moved quietly through the halls around him, speaking in tones too low for him to catch more than fragments. He heard the word confidentiality more than once. He heard someone mention his adoptive parents by name, which told him, with a cold certainty, that whoever was in that house had known exactly who he was for a lot longer than 3 hours. He began to wonder if coming here had been a mistake, if the truth he had spent 20 years chasing was going to stay locked behind a door he would never be allowed to open. While he waited, Grayson noticed small details he would remember for years afterward. A row of framed photographs along the hallway, none of which included a single child who looked anything like him. A staff member who kept glancing at him and then quickly looking away, as though she recognized something in his face she wasn't supposed to acknowledge. A grandfather clock in the corner that struck the hour twice while he sat there, each chime making the silence around him feel heavier than the one before it. He had spent 20 years imagining this moment 100 different ways, and not one of those imagined versions involved sitting alone in a stranger's house, waiting for permission to exist in his own mother's world. At one point, an older woman he assumed was a housekeeper paused in the doorway and looked at him for a long moment before quietly asking if he needed anything. When Grayson said no, she lingered anyway, and finally told him, almost in a whisper, that she had worked for the family for over 20 years and had never once heard anyone in that house speak his name until the last few months. It was a small comment, but it stayed with him. Somewhere behind those walls, people had been quietly aware of his existence far longer than he had any way of knowing. It was Charlotte who finally broke the standoff. She found Grayson still waiting, still holding the same folder of documents he had carried onto the plane, and she told him something that changed the entire shape of the story he thought he was living. She wasn't hired help. She was Eleanor's daughter, Grayson's half-sister, and she had found the sealed adoption file 8 months earlier while going through her grandfather's private papers after his death. She hadn't told her mother she knew. She hadn't told anyone. She had spent months quietly tracking Grayson down on her own, agonizing over whether reaching out was an act of love or a betrayal, before finally deciding that 20 years of silence had already cost their family enough. What Charlotte told him next explained the fear that had followed him through every hour in that house. Their grandfather, the man who built the Whitmore shipping empire from a single warehouse decades earlier, had been the one who forced Eleanor's hand when she was 22 and pregnant with no husband and no plan the family could publicly stand behind. He hadn't asked her to give Grayson up. According to the documents Charlotte found, he had arranged it himself, quietly, through people paid to make the entire situation disappear before it ever became a scandal that could threaten a pending business merger worth more than anyone in the family was willing to risk for one unplanned child. Grayson sat with that information longer than he sat with almost anything else that day. 20 years of believing his mother chose to walk away collapsed into a much harder truth, one where the woman who gave birth to him may never have been given a real choice at all. He didn't know whether that made things better or worse. He only knew that the anger he had carried for 2 decades now had somewhere new to go, and it wasn't entirely aimed at the woman still refusing to walk through her own living room door to face him. Eleanor finally appeared just before sunset, and Grayson later said the first thing he noticed wasn't her face, it was how much smaller she looked than every photograph he had studied for years. She didn't apologize right away. She didn't explain herself right away either. She simply stood in the doorway staring at a grown man who carried her own father's jawline and her late mother's eyes, and for a long moment neither of them said a single word, because 20 years of unanswered questions had finally run out of places left to hide. Word doesn't stay contained inside a house that size for very long, no matter how many lawyers are trying to hold it there. Within a week, a junior associate at the firm handling the Whitmore family's affairs mentioned the situation to a colleague over drinks, never imagining it would travel any further than that conversation. It traveled a great deal further. Within 10 days, a financial blog covering the shipping industry ran a short, vague item about an unnamed heir with an unresolved family matter that could affect an upcoming merger. It wasn't accurate. It wasn't even close to accurate. But it was enough to set off a chain reaction that neither Grayson nor Eleanor had any way of stopping once it started. The theories multiplied faster than anyone could correct them. Some outlets speculated that Grayson was a long-lost heir being groomed to challenge Charlotte for control of the company, a claim that had no basis in anything either sibling had discussed. Others suggested Eleanor had hidden Grayson to protect an affair rather than a business deal, dragging her late father's name through a scandal he could no longer defend himself against. A financial analyst went on record suggesting the entire story had been leaked deliberately by a rival firm hoping to derail the merger, a theory that gained traction for exactly 9 days before collapsing under its own weight. Grayson watched his own face appear in articles built almost entirely out of guesses, and he began to understand, for the first time, what it actually meant to be Eleanor Whitmore's son. One rumor in particular took hold harder than the rest. A commentator with a large following claimed to have sources inside the company confirming that Grayson had already hired an attorney of his own, preparing to contest his grandfather's estate and claim a portion of the fortune through inheritance law rather than wait for Eleanor to offer him anything voluntarily. The claim was false, invented entirely, but it spread quickly enough that strangers began recognizing Grayson in public, some sympathetic, some openly hostile, accusing him of chasing a payday 20 years in the making. He stopped going to his usual coffee shop that week. He stopped answering his phone unless the number was one he recognized. For a man who had spent his whole life invisible, the sudden visibility felt like its own kind of punishment. His adoptive parents, Frank and Linda, watched all of it unfold from Ohio, fielding calls from reporters who had somehow found their number within days of the first story breaking. Frank, a private man who had spent 30 years avoiding attention of any kind, found himself standing on his own front porch telling a camera crew to leave, while Linda quietly worried that the son she had raised was being pulled into a world neither of them fully understood. They never once made Grayson feel like he owed them an explanation for wanting to know his birth mother. But watching strangers debate their son's motives on television was its own kind of quiet heartbreak, one Grayson didn't fully appreciate until years later, when he finally asked them what those weeks had actually been like. Inside the house, the pressure took a different shape entirely. The company's board of directors, blindsided by headlines they hadn't been warned about, demanded an emergency meeting within 72 hours of the first story breaking. 2 board members, both allies of Eleanor's late father and both deeply invested in the merger moving forward without complication, argued privately that the situation needed to be, in their words, contained. One of them went further, suggesting Eleanor issue a statement denying any biological connection to Grayson entirely until the merger closed, a suggestion Eleanor rejected so firmly that the man never raised it again in her presence. She refused. For the first time in her career, she told her own board that she would rather lose the merger than lose the one chance she had left to make things right with her son, a decision that cost her 2 of her closest allies within the company almost immediately. Charlotte, meanwhile, was fighting a battle of her own. Word had reached her grandfather's oldest friend, a retired attorney who had helped orchestrate the original adoption decades earlier, that Charlotte was the one who found the sealed file and chose to act on it. He came to the house uninvited, furious, insisting that Charlotte had violated a confidentiality her grandfather had built an entire legal structure to protect, even in death. Charlotte, only 26 years old and facing down a man who had known her family longer than she had been alive, refused to back down. She told him plainly that she wasn't going to apologize for giving her brother the one thing their family had denied him for 20 years. The simple truth about where he came from. The old attorney didn't leave quietly. He warned Charlotte that reopening a file sealed under her grandfather's instructions could expose the family to liabilities none of them had considered: old agreements with the adoption agency, non-disclosure arrangements signed by people who had long since moved on with their lives, and financial settlements that had never been intended to become public record. For the first time, Charlotte understood that her decision hadn't simply reunited a family, it had potentially unlocked a much larger set of secrets her grandfather had spent decades keeping buried, secrets that had nothing to do with Grayson at all and everything to do with how the family's fortune had actually been protected over the years. Grayson, caught in the middle of a storm he never asked to be part of, spent those weeks doing something almost no one expected. He stopped reading the headlines. He stopped checking the forums that had once meant everything to him. Instead, he spent hours with Eleanor privately, away from lawyers and board members and reporters camped outside the gate, asking the questions he had carried since childhood and finally getting real answers instead of silence. He learned about the 6 minutes she had held him before signing the papers. He learned about the 2 private investigators she had hired and called off over the years, each time convincing herself he was better off without her. He learned that the fortune everyone else seemed obsessed with had never once been the thing Eleanor actually wanted him to know about. Their conversations weren't always calm. There were nights Grayson left the house angrier than when he arrived, replaying 20 years of birthdays and school events and quiet moments where a mother's absence had shaped him more than anyone around him ever fully understood. There were nights Eleanor sat alone afterward, staring at the same wooden box she kept in her desk drawer, wondering whether rebuilding something this broken was even possible at her age, with her history, with everything the two of them still didn't know about each other. Neither of them pretended the process was easy. Both of them, for reasons neither fully explained to the other, kept showing up anyway. By the 4th week, the public story had mostly moved on to the next scandal, the way public stories always do, but the private one inside that house had only just begun to take real shape. Eleanor's legal team quietly prepared paperwork none of them had been asked to prepare yet, drafting language for an inheritance, a board position, a public statement introducing Grayson as her son. They assumed, reasonably, that this was where the story was heading. What none of them accounted for was the conversation happening upstairs between Eleanor and Grayson, one that was about to take the entire situation somewhere none of the lawyers, none of the board, and not even Eleanor herself, had seen coming. The conversation that changed everything didn't happen in a boardroom, and it didn't happen in front of a single camera or a single lawyer. It happened late one night in Eleanor's study, a room Charlotte later said almost no one outside the family had ever been allowed into, surrounded by decades of photographs that told the story of a company but almost nothing about the woman who built it. Eleanor pulled a small wooden box from the bottom drawer of her desk, one Grayson would later describe as the most ordinary object in the entire house, and inside it was everything she had never been able to explain to anyone, not her board, not her closest friends, not even Charlotte until recently. Inside that box was a photograph of Grayson as a newborn, the only one Eleanor had ever been allowed to keep. Beneath it were folded records from a foundation Eleanor had quietly funded for nearly 15 years, one that provided legal support and financial assistance to young, unmarried mothers facing the exact pressure she had faced at 22. She had never put her name on it publicly. She had never allowed the foundation to be connected to the Whitmore company in any official capacity, because doing so would have meant explaining why a woman with no known children cared so deeply about protecting the choices of birth mothers everywhere else. Eleanor finally told Grayson the full story that night, without a lawyer softening a single sentence of it. Her father hadn't asked her opinion when the merger deal depended on the family's reputation staying spotless. He had made the arrangements before she had fully recovered from giving birth, presenting the adoption to her as something already decided rather than something she still had a choice in. She was 22, financially dependent on a family that controlled everything from her allowance to her future role in the company, and she told Grayson plainly that she had spent every year since wondering whether fighting harder that day would have changed anything at all, or simply cost her everything she eventually used to try and make it right. She told him about the day she signed the papers, how her father waited in the hallway rather than the room itself, unwilling to watch, and how a nurse had quietly given her an extra few minutes with the baby that hadn't been part of the arrangement. Minutes Eleanor said she had replayed in her mind more times than she could count over the following 20 years. She told him about the first year afterward, when she considered leaving the family business entirely, and about the moment she decided instead to stay and eventually take control of it, telling herself that if she could never raise the son she'd lost, she could at least build something that might one day allow her to find him on her own terms. She also told him something she had never said out loud to anyone, not even Charlotte. Every year, on the date she believed to be his birthday, Eleanor closed her office door for exactly 1 hour and allowed herself to grieve a version of her life she had never been permitted to live. No meetings, no calls, no explanations offered to a staff that had long since learned not to ask. Grayson realized, listening to her describe it, that somewhere in Ohio, on that same date every year, he had spent his own version of that hour staring at a birth certificate with a blank space where her name should have been, both of them marking the same day in the same private grief without either one ever knowing the other was doing it too. Grayson sat with all of it in silence for a long time. He thought about the 2 failed investigators Eleanor had hired and called off, the box in that desk drawer, the foundation with no name attached to it, and he realized the mother he had spent 20 years imagining as absent had actually spent those same 20 years quietly trying to help every version of herself she could still reach, even while believing she had lost the chance to help the one that mattered most. It didn't erase the years he had spent without her. It didn't answer every question he still carried. But it gave him something he hadn't expected to walk away with, an understanding that the silence hadn't been indifference at all. The next morning, Eleanor's legal team arrived with the paperwork they had quietly prepared over the previous weeks, ready to formally introduce Grayson as her son, ready to discuss a place for him within the company, a share of the estate, a public announcement designed to control the story before anyone else could shape it for her. Eleanor gathered the family in the same study where she and Grayson had spoken the night before, and she told her lawyers, her board representatives, and her daughter that before anything else was decided, Grayson deserved to speak first. Every person in that room expected Grayson to accept what was being offered. 20 years of struggle, a childhood built around one unanswered question, and now, finally, a chance at everything that question had been withholding from him. Eleanor herself, watching her son across the room, believed she already knew what he was going to say. She had spent 30 years learning how to read a room full of people deciding what they wanted, and every instinct she had told her this conversation was about to end exactly the way everyone expected. She was wrong, and within the next few minutes, she would understand that her son had inherited something from her that no lawyer in that room had accounted for, the same stubborn refusal to accept the easy version of a decision that actually mattered. Grayson stood in front of the people who had spent weeks deciding his future without ever fully consulting him, and he said no. Not to Eleanor. Not to the relationship they had only just started rebuilding. He said no to the inheritance, no to the board seat, no to every version of the offer built around folding him quietly into the fortune everyone assumed he had come for in the first place. He told the room, calmly and without a single note prepared in advance, that he hadn't spent 20 years searching for money. He had spent 20 years searching for the truth, and he had already found it, sitting in a wooden box in his mother's desk drawer, long before anyone offered him a single signature to make it official. What Grayson asked for instead left even Eleanor's most experienced lawyers without an immediate response. He didn't want his name attached to the company. He wanted Eleanor's foundation, The one that had operated quietly for 15 years supporting young mothers facing the exact pressure she had once faced, brought fully into the open. He wanted it publicly connected to the Whitmore name, properly funded at a scale the family had never allowed before, and expanded to include legal support specifically for birth parents who wanted contact with the children they had placed for adoption but didn't know how to begin looking. He wanted the story that had cost his mother 20 years of silence to become the reason no other family had to carry that same silence alone. One of the lawyers in the room, a man who had worked for Eleanor's father before her, tried to argue that a public announcement of that scale would reopen every question the family had spent weeks trying to quiet, that it would invite scrutiny into exactly the kind of old arrangements Charlotte's grandfather's attorney had already warned them about. Eleanor listened to the entire objection without interrupting, and when he finished, she told him she understood the risk better than anyone else in that room, and she was choosing to accept it anyway, because the alternative was raising a company on the same foundation of silence that had already cost her 20 years with her own son. Charlotte, watching the exchange unfold, later said it was the first time she had ever seen her mother visibly choose her family over the company in front of the people whose job it was to protect it. She reached across the table during the silence that followed and took Eleanor's hand, a small gesture that neither of them acknowledged out loud, but one that Grayson noticed, and one he later said told him everything he needed to know about the family he had spent 20 years searching for. Eleanor didn't answer right away. Grayson later said the room stayed quiet long enough that he genuinely wasn't sure whether he had just repaired something between them or destroyed it completely. Then Eleanor did something none of her board members had seen her do in 30 years of running the company. She stood up, walked around her own desk, and told her legal team to draft the announcement exactly the way her son had just described it, with her name and the foundation's work made public for the first time, regardless of what it meant for the merger, regardless of what her father would have said, and regardless of how it would look to a board that had spent weeks trying to manage her out of an inconvenient scandal. The public reaction, when the announcement finally came weeks later, wasn't what anyone inside that house had prepared for either. Instead of the scandal analysts had predicted, coverage shifted almost entirely toward the foundation itself, toward the young mothers it had already helped anonymously for years, and toward a son who had been offered a fortune and chosen accountability instead. Letters began arriving at the foundation's newly public offices within days, from birth mothers who had spent decades wondering whether the children they placed for adoption ever thought about them, and from adult adoptees who, like Grayson, had spent years searching for a name on a single sealed document. The merger that two board members had once threatened to walk away over closed successfully within the following quarter, with new partners specifically citing the company's transparency as a reason for their confidence, a detail none of Eleanor's original advisors had predicted and one they were quietly grateful for. Grayson never joined the company, and he never took a share of the estate his mother tried more than once to insist on. He did, however, stay close to the family in a way none of them, including him, had expected when he first booked that flight. He and Charlotte built the kind of relationship neither had grown up with, one built on choice rather than obligation, spending holidays together that neither had originally planned to share. He and Eleanor spoke regularly, slowly repairing 20 years in the only way that was ever actually possible, one honest conversation at a time, neither of them pretending the years apart had simply disappeared. Frank and Linda Hale, the two people who had raised Grayson without ever once making him feel like something was missing, eventually met Eleanor face to face nearly a year after that first phone call. Grayson said it was one of the strangest, most emotional afternoons of his life, watching the two sets of parents who had shaped him from opposite directions sit at the same table, no tension between them, only a shared understanding of how much they had all, in their own separate ways, spent 20 years loving the same person. When people ask Grayson now why he walked away from $400 million, he tells them the same thing every time. He didn't walk away from anything. He simply decided that some truths are worth more than any fortune built on keeping them hidden, and that the real inheritance his mother owed him was never going to be money in the first place. It was the truth, freely given, and the chance to make sure the silence that had shaped his own life never had to shape anyone else's again. Grayson Hale spent 20 years believing the woman who gave him away simply didn't want him, and it took one envelope with no return address to unravel every assumption he had built his entire identity around. His story asks a question that reaches far beyond one family, one fortune, and one reunion. When someone finally gets the chance to take everything they believe they are owed, what does it actually say about them when they choose something else entirely? Grayson had every right to accept the inheritance sitting in front of him. Instead, he chose to turn a private reunion into something that could genuinely help people he would never meet, and that decision changed the way an entire company, and an entire family, understood what accountability actually looks like when no one is forcing you into it. We want to know what you think. Would you have made the same choice Grayson made, or after 20 years of searching, do you believe he earned the right to take what was finally being offered to him? Let us know in the comments, and while you're there, tell us where in the world you're watching this from, because stories like this one reach further than we ever expect, and we genuinely love hearing from you. If this story moved you, stay close, because the next one might hit even harder. We recently uncovered the story of two sisters, separated at birth and raised on opposite sides of the country, who spent nearly a decade unknowingly working for the same company, competing for the very same promotion, before either of them ever learned the other existed. It's a story about coincidence, identity, and the strange ways families find their way back to each other even when no one is looking. If you don't want to miss it, make sure you're subscribed, because we release stories like this one every single week, and this next one is coming soon.